Welcome. We've been talking at Seven Rivers this winter, preaching on encounters with Jesus. You know, it's interesting that these encounters with Jesus often happen in the most unexpected ways. Jesus passed through a village. Jesus encountered someone. It wasn't on anybody's itinerary for that day. And suddenly they encountered God himself in the flesh, and their lives were never the same. You know, that's really our prayer for you as we all experience the contagion of Corona together. We're going through our daily lives. 2020 is just going to be like last year and the year before, humdrum with metronomic sameness, and bam, everything is transformed. We're experiencing a year like we've never have before, and that experience is an opportunity for us to encounter Jesus. That's our prayer for you, that life being turned upside down, we might find ourselves experiencing Jesus in a way we haven't before. So I'm going to read from Luke chapter 23. If you don't have a Bible, if you're just going to follow the words on the screen, let me encourage you to turn the service off for just a second and get a Bible so that you can be looking at it as I preach and read the words together. So it is Luke chapter 23, beginning at the 32nd verse. Two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with Jesus. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They cast lots to divide his garments. The people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked Jesus, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." Now one of the criminals who were hanged railed at Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the reading of God's holy word. So three men are being crucified. Jesus in the center, one on his right, one on his left. And the challenge for you is, which one of those men are you? It's interesting how often the Bible presses that question for us. The Bible starts with the story of two brothers, right? Cain and Abel. One brings a sacrifice worthy, the other an unworthy sacrifice. And we're pressed to ask, which are we? Are we like Cain, or are we like Abel? So it is with Jesus healing the 10 lepers. Are we the one leper who comes back and expresses gratitude, or are we the 9 who don't? Judas and the other disciples. Are we the 11 who remain faithful to Jesus unto death, or are we like Judas, the one who falls away? The prodigal son, right? There's a son who goes to the faraway country, but ultimately he's back home with his dad, reconciled. But there's a proud, arrogant, pharisaical, another son, an older brother. Which are you? Are you the younger or the older? So the Bible is always pressing us, Mary or Martha, right? Which are you? Story after story. And so Luke 23 brings us to Holy Week. This is Palm Sunday on the church calendar. This is the day that Jesus makes his way into the holy city. He goes into the temple, he cleanses the temple. It's Thursday night of that same week that Jesus meets with his disciples in the upper room, and there they celebrate the Passover together, establishing for us the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. They go out to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prays. Subsequently, he's arrested. Then comes his trial and his sentencing. He bears the cross. He goes up onto Golgotha, Calvary, and there he is crucified, but he's not alone. There are two others beside him. And so what do we learn of their deaths? One dies an angry man, an angry cynic, and the other dies hearing the sweetest words that you could ever hear. And the question will be, which are you? I don't want to be overly dramatic, but it really is a question of life or death. It really matters. I really want you to lean in and get this. So in the outline, we'll start then with this. Dying man number one. He is an angry cynic. He's angry. Around him, there's a lot of anger. The Jewish leadership is mocking Jesus. The Roman soldiers are making fun of Jesus. You know, this is like no king we've ever seen. They put the placard above his head mocking the king of the Jews. They'd already placed a crown of thorns on his head. They, like the cupbearer to the king, they offer him cheap wine. The entire scene is filled with mockery. But here's a man who's actually being crucified next to Jesus, who is railing at Jesus as well. He's angry. Why is he angry? Well, for one, he's being crucified, and he would believe that he's being unjustly punished. You see, these two guys are often referred to as, the thieves, the thief on the cross. But the Romans didn't execute people for stealing purses, for thievery. They executed for sedition. All three of these men are being executed because to the Romans, they have not been loyal to Caesar. They are guilty of fomenting insurrection. The Jews were accused Jesus of blasphemy, but the Romans don't care about the Jews and blasphemy of the Jewish God. What they care about is loyalty to Caesar. That's why they're up there. So this man, in his eyes, this dying man number one, he's William Wallace, right? He's Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death. He is Martin Luther King Jr., fighting for the freedom of his people, and now he's being crushed by Rome. And he's been stripped naked. He's hanging there. He's being this excruciating, interesting word, like excruciating actually comes from the word cross, the worst imaginable physical death. He's angry at the treatment that he's receiving for only attempting to be faithful to God and rid the Holy Land of these pagan Roman people. And that's why he's angry at Jesus too, because he turns to Jesus and says, if you're the Messiah, when Messiah comes, Messiah is going to come with an iron fist, and he is going to shatter Rome and set his people free. So what kind of Messiah are you? If you're really the Messiah, then get yourself off the cross and get us off the cross too. So he's right there. He's going through the exact same experience as Jesus, and he misses Jesus. He's angry and he's bitter. Why does he miss Jesus? Because he has a wrong perception of the messianic mission. We know that Jesus is going to come in judgment one day, but not in his first coming. Isaiah 53 says that the Messiah would be despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. The Messiah was going to be a suffering servant. He was going to go low so that he could lift us up. Isaiah 53 verse 5 says, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds, we are healed. The wounds of Jesus are the fulfillment of his very messianic mission. So the cynic missed that. He missed it completely. But not only that, we can see from him that his conception of God is skewed. He's more interested in God as a means than he is in God as an end. He gives God a test, doesn't he? Essentially he says, if you get me off this cross, then I'll be your follower. If you get me off this cross, then I'll proclaim you the Messiah. But that's ultimately what I want. Get me off this cross. Everybody, we have to realize that he doesn't want What he wants is a life that works. He has an immediate need. And if you don't meet my need, he's saying to Jesus, then you're not God. You know, our catechism says the chief end of man is to glorify God. Well, he believes, the bitter cynic dying there believes, that the chief end of God is to take care of his personal well-being. He believed, he doesn't want a God, he wants a personal assistant, right? I tell you what to do, you do it, our relationship works very well. Everybody turns to God in trouble, have you noticed that? You know, nationwide, churches are somewhat astounded at having a greater viewership for online worship than they actually have for attendance in church on weekends. Because the worldwide pandemic gets people's attention, right? The problem is people turn to God, but why do they turn to God? They turn to God not to get God, but because they want a life that works. He is just a means to an end. Many people die angry and apart from God because when they rang for him, he didn't come running. And you'll die bitter unless you get it, that God isn't interested in giving you a life of ease. He might leave you on the cross. He's interested in giving you something better. He's interested in giving you himself. So, dying man number one dies a bitter, angry man, railing at God. But let's look at dying man number two, because he's just as bitter, he's just as angry. Do you know it says in Matthew and Mark that both criminals were assailing Jesus, were hammering Jesus with their words. But then something happens to dying man number two. Something right on the cross. In the last minutes of his life, he's transformed. The cataracts fall from his eyes. He sees, and he's converted. It's beautiful. And how does it happen? Well, he sees Jesus. And what is it that he sees Jesus do? In the midst of all this hostility, what does Jesus say? Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. And when he sees this mercy pour out of Jesus' heart and cross his lips, you know what that dying man thinks? There's mercy here. I wonder if there's mercy for me. And he grabs that mercy. And you know, the first thing we see about his conversion is that he sees his own guilt. He confesses his own guilt. Listen, I don't think either of the men dying with Jesus feel guilty for rebellion against Rome. That's not what he sees. He sees the righteousness of God manifested before him. Here's a man being tortured to death with no legitimate grounds, and yet he's praying for God to have mercy and grace on the people who are doing this to him. He sees that he's not worthy. It's like Peter. Remember the great catch of fish after the resurrection? And when Peter comes to Jesus in the boat, when Jesus comes to Peter in the boat, Peter says, get away from me, get away from me. I can't, I'm too unclean for you. I could have nothing to do for you. This man sees the greatness of Jesus there, and he confesses his sin. And what else does he do? He pleads for mercy. Jesus, he says, will you remember me? Will you remember me when you come in your kingdom? He doesn't ask Jesus to get him off the cross. He doesn't ask for relief. He doesn't ask for the pandemic to go away. He asks for Jesus. You know, it's not unusual. Again, in hardship, people turn to God. God, says the young girl whose boyfriend has jilted her. God, would you bring my boyfriend back? Would you change his mind? God, would you do that for me? I've been your faithful servant. I love you. God, please bring my boyfriend back. It'd be much more appropriate and healthy to say, God, would you help me to experience you in such a way at the loss of my boyfriend that I would stop being so needy, that I would stop being so awkward in social situations because I'm so desperate, and that you would make me a secure person so that whether I ever have a boyfriend again, I have you, and that's enough. God, if you say, in the midst of Corona, give me my 401k back. God, give us school again. God, restore everything to the way that it was just a month or two ago. That's what we've got to have life. And God may say, no, I have no intention to do you. You see, that's often our aim. God, we don't want you. You're just a means to an end. We're interested in you, but only to the degree that you'll come through for us. You know what Dying Man 2 says? Leave me on the cross. He never asks for Jesus to rescue him physically. Leave me on the cross. But just remember me. To forfeit Jesus and get the good life is hell. But to forfeit the good life and get Jesus is paradise. Brian Fickert, that's Jessica Fickert on our staff's dad, tells the story of a church in Africa, the Living Word Church, where every Saturday night they had choir practice. And whether the rest of the village wanted to or not, they all heard the choir sing because their church was just sort of a ramshackle, tar paper shack sort of building. It had big gaps in the walls. So when they sang vibrantly and joyously, everybody heard. Well, one Friday in that village, in a country ravaged by civil war, rebels came and they entered the village. Some were killed, some were dragged away. Almost every dwelling in place was burned and destroyed, including the Living Word Church structure. But amazingly enough, the next day, in this devastated village at 8 o'clock on Saturday night, all the choir members gathered without any prompting for choir practice. And they stood in the ruins of their church and they sang to the glory of God. See, that's it. They lost everything, but they had Jesus. That's what happens to dying thief, the dying criminal, number 2. Fernando Ortega, a number of years ago, sang the song, "In the morning when I rise, give me Jesus. And when I come to die, give me Jesus. You can have all this world, but give me Jesus." Dying man number 1, he dies a bitter cynic. Dying man number 2, he dies with joy, converted. Which man are you? Now there was a third dying, and he is the center of the story, as always, the merciful Christ. So what happens when the dying man number 2 says, "Jesus, will you remember me?" How does Jesus respond? Some of the most beautiful words ever in the whole Bible. "This day," he said, "this day, you will be with me in paradise." So when he makes his plea for mercy, what does he receive? He receives grace, promiscuous grace. I mean, minutes ago, he's slamming Jesus. He's railing at Jesus. Now he asks for mercy, and mercy is gladly granted. Do you understand how salvation is by grace? What does this man do to earn it? He has no merit. He hasn't done anything. He's never made a tithe. He's never been on a mission trip. He's never loved his neighbor. He does nothing. It all depends on the mercy and grace of Jesus. That's how we're converted. That's how we become his. Brandon was showing me a week or so ago a TV interview on a national network where the interview was asking the mayor of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, about closing churches and were they having a problem with that. And the mayor said, no, the churches are cooperating because they believe in loving their neighbor. He said, the mayor said, that's the point of the parable of the Good Samaritan, is that you consider your neighbor as a greater regard than you. And to that, the TV announcer said, that's right, just like the good book says, God takes care of those who take care of themselves. Or God helps those who help themselves. And the irony of that, of course, is that's the exact opposite of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is somebody who helps someone who's completely beat up, dead, virtually on the ground. He can do nothing for himself. That's the point, is that God helps those who can do nothing for themselves. It's all grace. For by grace are you saved through faith, and not of yourself. It's a gift of God. We contribute nothing. If you ask somebody, are you a Christian? And they say, I'm really trying. Then what do you know? They don't understand it. They don't understand the grace of God. This is an amazing conversion. It's not just the 11th hour, it's the 11th hour and 59th minute. Reminds me of a tombstone epitaph in a small cemetery in a country church in the United Kingdom. It's obviously referring to a man who dies when he falls off his horse, because the epitaph says, between the stirrup and the ground, I mercy asked, I mercy found. I mean, that's ridiculous. Pastor, that's ridiculous. You mean falling off the horse, crying for mercy, that would be enough to save a man? Listen, that's what we have here right in the Bible. The one screaming curses says, remember me. And Jesus says, absolutely, yes. Crazy grace, crazy mercy. Not only do you get grace, you get freed from the fear of death. This day you'll be with me in paradise. Yeah, people are dying in the world from corona. People are dying in our country. Maybe some of your friends are sick. But you know what? Everybody watching this film is dying. Everybody's dying. Isn't it incredible how short life is? Those of us who are over, I don't know, the age of 50, you start to really realize it. It goes by so fast. We're all dying. To be free from the fear of death. This day, you'll be with me in paradise. If you have Jesus, your death day is genuinely a greater day than your birthday. An elderly woman in our church died recently. She was a dear follower of Jesus. She laid for a number of days before her death, comatose, not responding, seemingly in another world. And then suddenly, just before she died, she lurched forward in bed. She reached out with her hands and she said, wow. This day you'll be with me in paradise. So you get grace. You're freed from the fear of death. And what else do you get? You know what the emphasis of that? This day you shall be with me. That's it. It's with me in paradise. This is the fulfillment of our lifelong dream to be, our deepest desire to be reconnected with God. Do you know the word paradise is the same word as garden. Jesus is saying to the thief on the cross, this day you'll be with me in the Garden of Eden. This day, what Adam and Eve had when they would walk with God in the cool of the day, such intimacy. This day you'll know that kind of intimacy with God. Do you know that when that thief asked Jesus for mercy, he says, Jesus, remember me. It's the only time in the Bible anybody calls Jesus by just that intimate name, his name. Not Jesus the Lord, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus. It's really sweet. It's intense. In just the last 2 months, I've reconnected with a childhood friend. I hadn't seen him in over 30 years. And unfortunately, that reconnection came about because he's got terminal cancer. And I've been to see him twice, and concerned to be sure that he's ready to die, I sent him one of Tim Keller's books, The Prodigal God. And when we talked on the phone last week, my friend told me, he said, I've read that book 4 times. And he said, Keller's right. Everybody's looking for a family. Everybody wants to go home. He said, you know what I realized? I've been looking for that family my whole life. And so are we all. This day, you will be with me in paradise. One of the sad things in this pandemic is that people are dying alone. Their family can't be with them. But let me tell you something. Ask Jesus to remember you, and you'll never be alone again. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art what? With me. This is a challenge, being a pastor or a leader. This kind of corona upheaval. Let me tell you what gives me strength every day. He leadeth me, right? Oh, blessed thought, right? That God is with me. For you to know, come hell or high water, that God is with you. This day, you will be with me in paradise, that you matter to him, that you belong to him. Ask him Ask him to remember you. 2 men died, one on Jesus' right, one on Jesus' left. Which one of those men are you? Amen. Let's pray together. Jesus, if we don't find you in the midst of Corona, if we don't turn to you, not just as a means of making it through, but if we don't see that everything in this world is temporary, and the only thing that will always be with us is you, then we've missed the moment. Lord, we don't want to be angry and bitter. We don't want to be like the cynic. We want to be like the man who pleads, Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom. Oh, may it be so. Amen.